All right, to all who are new here, my name is Dr. Michelle Henney, and I'd like to welcome you to Releve Sports Medicine's Virtual Journal Club. For additional webinar educational opportunities, you can visit our website and register directly for the webinar, or sign up for the email list to be notified of upcoming webinars. We are continuing to update our schedule, so check back often. This video will be available for review after the Journal Club. The information contained in the video content represent the views and opinions of the presenters and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Releve Sports Medicine. The mere appearance of video content on the website does not constitute an endorsement by RSM or its affiliates of such video content. The video content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The video content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have read or seen on this site. Thus, RSM hereby disclaims any and all liability to any party for any direct, indirect, implied, punitive, special, incidental, or other consequential damages arising directly or indirectly from any use of the video content, which is provided as is and without warranties. We thank you for your patience in awaiting the statements of credit from the webinar in September while we were recovering from the hurricane. Our IT person who oversees our statements of credit was able to complete these, and these are now available on our website for you to download. We are looking for an athletic trainer to join our team. This is a full-time clinic-based physician working in a sports medicine clinic. Feel free to pass our information along if you know of a qualified candidate. More information regarding applying can be found on our website. For all athletic trainers who are intending to get live CEUs from the BOC, you will receive an email 1 hour after the webinar concludes, which includes a combined link, to the combined quiz, evaluation, and assessment. You will have up to 72 hours to complete the quiz and the evaluation. This email will come from customercare@gotowebinar.com. Please ensure that this is done to receive your statement of credit. If you don't receive the follow-up email or have any other concerns, then contact us via our email at journalclub@relevesportsmedicine.com. Once the statement of credit is available for download from our website, you will receive an email notification. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit the question and we will review questions at the conclusion of the presentation. If you cannot see the PowerPoint slides and you're accessing the webinar from your mobile phone, swipe the screen to the left or to the right and the slides will become visible. The recording will be available for review from our website tomorrow. I am pleased to present our speaker for this evening, Dr. Thomas Dompier. Currently serves as an associate professor of athletic training at Lebanon Valley College, located in Annville, Pennsylvania. He is a fellow of the National Athletic Trainers Association and has been an athletic trainer for 25 years. He has studied sports injury epidemiology for nearly 18 of those. Prior to joining the faculty at Lebanon Valley College, Dr. Dompier served as the president of the Datalys Center for Sports Injury Research and Prevention, located in Indianapolis, Indiana. Dr. Dompier provided oversight of the Datalys Center's research programs, including the NCAA Injury Surveillance Program, the High School National Athletic Treatment, Injury, and Outcomes Network, NATION, and Project CARE, Concussion Awareness, Research and Education, the Youth Football Safety Program, and the Lacrosse Study Tracking Injuries and Concussions in Kids, LAX-STICK program, all of which you would note would not have been possible without the dedication of thousands of athletic trainers. Dr. Dompier received his bachelor and doctoral degrees from Michigan State University, a master's degree from the Pennsylvania State University, and also completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of South Carolina and Fort Jackson Army Training Center. We are pleased to have him present today on the clinical epidemiology for athletic trainers.
Thank you for the warm introduction. I hope you can see is it the full slide screen showing or is the?
Yes.
Okay, I wasn't sure which one it was showing, but very good, thank you. And again, it's great to be here. It's such a pleasure to speak to you all today. I appreciate Jessica and Ann for the invitation to speak. I'm very passionate about epidemiology and preventing injuries, particularly at the youth setting. My formal PhD is actually in growth and development from Michigan State University, then with a research emphasis in epidemiology. My mentor was John Powell, who if you're not familiar with the world of epidemiology, ran the NFL's injury surveillance program for about 30 years, the NHL for a while. He helped basically create the backbone for which is now the NCAA Injury Surveillance Program, and I'll talk a little bit about that history some more in detail. So I always give a special thanks to all the athletic trainers. Without the athletic trainers participating in injury surveillance programs, I wouldn't be able to do the research that I do. So again, appreciate all those folks out there helping us out. The obligatory financial disclosure slide, I have none to report. I am going to briefly mention several EMRs throughout my presentation, but I don't have any stock or financial relationship with those EMRs. So what is injury surveillance? Surveillance helps us understand the problem well enough that we can determine some risk factors and then perhaps develop some interventions that might mitigate those risk factors. So it's the who, what, when, where, at least in my world, injury epidemiology or sports injury. I believe as athletic trainers, we have a responsibility to provide these data to different surveillance programs. If you're working in the NCAA, for example, or if you're working in high schools, there's programs that you can be a part of that help us track injuries, to report those out, publish them so that athletic trainers can use that in real time. And what this presentation is going to do for us today is talk about how athletic trainers in the clinical setting can use these data that have been published to understand the risk of their own sport or their own institution's sports in terms of injury risk and prevalence. So this is kind of a take on Van Mechelen's kind of famous sequence of injury prevention. It starts with surveillance, the who, what, when, where. We got to know who's getting hurt, where and when they get hurt. That leads us to developing or examining further risk factors that we perhaps mitigate. From there, we go to the intervention phase, which generally involves either policy or rule changes, perhaps advancements in equipment technology, or just adding additional technology or equipment to the sport. And then the cycle repeats by doing surveillance again and seeing if anything has changed. The example I always like to use with this is the 2012 kickoff rule change in the NCAA football, where they moved the kickoff line up 5 yards and allow the teams to start at the 25 if they take a touchback. The reason why that rule came upon us is because from the data from the injury surveillance program, we were able to determine that there is an exceptional number of ACL sprains and hamstring strains and concussions occurring during kickoffs. Now, kickoffs, there isn't many kickoffs during a particular game. There might, theoretically, there possibly could only be 2 or 3, but they disproportionately accounted for those more severe injuries. So that rule change occurred, and we were able to compare the pre-rule change data to the post-rule change data, and we're able to detect that the rule change did make a difference, at least in the first couple of years, until coaches started figuring out ways around it. But at least initially it worked as we thought it or hoped it would. But that injury surveillance, the only way that we were able to detect that difference was having the pre-rule change data and then the post-rule change data. So we were able to make those comparisons, and that's the benefit of ongoing injury surveillance. And the NCAA Injury Surveillance Program has been ongoing since 1986 in earnest. Started a little bit sooner, and I'll talk about that to some degree. All right, so another example of prevention is I think it was 2007, Randy Dick published a paper from the NCAA data that demonstrated that women's sport athletes tend to have a higher risk of ACL sprain. And from that, we determined, or other researchers were able to determine, that jump landing characteristics, among some other factors, were the reason why women seem to have a higher risk. From that, there were interventions developed, like the Jump ACL program that the University of North Carolina did with the Naval Cadets. Tim Hewitt developed an injury prevention program for the ACL. So there were several programs that came out of that in terms of interventions that seem to be effective if they're actually conducted. But from there, then we can monitor if that's made any changes over time, and it seems to have when those programs are actually implemented. So some other examples of injury surveillance programs that are supported by ATs include the Datalys Center, where I used to work prior to LVC. We manage the NCAA Injury Surveillance Program, High School Rio, which just came online recently. Used to be run by the Children's Hospital out of Ohio and Don Comstock, but Datalys recently assumed that. And then we also created the High School Nation project, which continues on to this day. I'm also a collaborator for the National Center for Catastrophic Sports Injury Research and Consortium, and that's run out of Chapel Hill. That one specifically focuses on catastrophic injuries, sudden cardiac arrest, traumatic brain injuries, that sort of thing. And then AT Still, the athletic training practice-based research network is kind of unique because they also collect patient-reported outcomes similar to the High School Nation project. Pac-12 has a program. The Big Ten used to, but it kind of faded away after John Powell retired. He used to run that. And then the National Football League, NBA, and NHL all have programs ongoing. I'm not sure about the MLB, if they have their own program or not. These are some of the compliant EMRs, but what I mean by compliant is when Steve Marshall and I reimagined the NCAA Injury Surveillance Program back in 2009, we use what's called a common data element standard, which allows us to extract data from different EMRs, but when we receive it into our database, it's de-identified and it's all coded the same way. So even if one EMR codes something ABC and another one codes it 123, it comes to us as 485, for example. That'd be like a ACL sprain. And that's called a common data element standard. And we got that idea from the NIH. They've done that with several different databases that they manage. So we use that same approach to sports injury, which allows us to collect data from these different EMRs that you see here, which makes it much more inclusive of different schools, different size schools, different things, because each of these EMRs are a little bit different. But the great news is when it gets to the Datalys Center, it's all coded the same. So it allows more athletic trainers to participate, and they don't have to change the EMR that they already have if they want to participate, if it's one of these ones that are compliant with Datalys. And High School Nation and the NCISP, as well as High School Rio, all have EMRs that are free to athletic trainers in high schools and other, even colleges and universities. If they don't generally have as many bells and whistles as the commercial vendors would have, but I think they function just as well. We get a lot of positive feedback about them. All right, so going into the history a little bit. So the NCAA Injury Surveillance Program, in which then a lot of high school systems have stemmed off of that, actually started back in 1974 with Ken Clark and Bud Miller, Sayers Bud Miller. Bud was an ATC, Ken was a public health researcher at Penn State. John Powell, Bill Buckley, and John Miller were actually their research assistants. And that program carried on to about 1982 when the NARES funding ended. And they really only focused primarily on football during that period, but they did start branching out into other injuries as well. When the NARES funding ended, Eric Zemper took over the NCAA's project, doing more periodic studies versus robust surveillance. And then John Powell took over the Big Ten and the NFL's injury surveillance program about that time after he graduated out of Penn State. And then in 1986, Randy Dick managed the NCAA program after Eric Zemper left. And that was paper pencil. And as a clinician, when I worked in college ice hockey, I actually did the paper pencil surveillance for the NCAA. But then in 2004, 2009, they created an online EMR that was free for athletic trainers to use. But again, the limitation of that system is that you had to use the NCAA system. I think the benefit that the surveillance system that I created for the NCAA in 2009 was that it allowed athletic trainers to use different surveillance systems, and it allowed us to get the data in the same way despite the different systems.
I apologize for interrupting. It looks like we're able to see your title slide, but it doesn't appear that the slide
switching. Oof.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. Oh yes, now they're advancing.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize it wasn't advancing as I was going through. So I'll just kind of, I don't think there's anything in terms of the pictures and stuff that are too needed, but I hope, I don't know if you're able to share the slides with the attendees prior, but feel free to share slides also that I sent.
Okay.
So again, I think this is a slide I was just on here. So again, I apologize for that. That's a bit embarrassing.
No problem. It's technology. We get it.
This whole doing online webinars and everything since the COVID happened has just been a learning experience all around.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, and I'll quit interrupting.
All right. So again, what we did then is in 2009, in addition to also creating the EMR, the multiple EMR approaches, we also changed the definition of injury by collecting the data directly from the EMR allowed us to collect all injuries. And I'll talk about what those definitions are here in a minute, but it allowed us to do several different things we couldn't do before. In 2017, we began publishing the major data sets, that some of which I'm going to present here today from those data collected with the new system. And then most recently, the Datalys Center. I left the Datalys Center in 2017, and then in 2021, by contract, the Datalys Center has to publish the NCAA data sets every 5 years so that researchers and other clinicians and whatnot can use those data in real time. So in terms of the definition of injury, the original NAIRS project defined injury as an injury that caused the athlete to miss at least 24 hours beyond the date of injury. So if they got hurt on a Monday, they also had to miss practice or a competition on Tuesday to be counted as an injury. So we know as sports medicine professionals that excludes a lot of injuries, because there will be athletes that'll suffer through sometimes weeks or even the entire season fighting off some sort of tendonitis or other things that we're managing throughout the season, but they don't necessarily miss a lot of time or even any time. Sometimes they just battle through those. So we thought they were going to be missing some injuries with that definition, but the reason why they came up with that definition initially back in 1974 was because there was no computers. And what was happening was that the athletic trainers who were reporting the injuries had to document injuries once for themselves to keep in their records, but then they had to provide that documentation also to the researchers. So they were basically double entering data, as we would say. That continued on until 2004 when Dr. John Powell and I, this was while I was working on my PhD as his research assistant, and we came up with a non-time loss and time loss definition. And because we were using an EMR, only a single EMR, we were able to extract all patient contacts that athletic trainers had. So they generally, an athletic trainer will document any patient contact, or at least we believe they should, for record keeping purposes. And in that, we should be able to get all those overuse injuries, non-time loss injuries that might not otherwise fit the time loss definition of missing 24 hours beyond a day of injury. So then in 2009, when Steve and I rebuilt the NCAA Injury Surveillance Program into what it is today, we included that non-time loss and time loss definition to make it more inclusive of all the injuries that an athletic trainer would see. We've been able to use that same technology then for the high school program, the nation program, as well as the youth programs that we've created. So the cool thing about that is, and I'm sorry if I'm kind of geeking out a little bit, but it really allows us to compare apples to apples to apples. Now they might be a Granny Smith apple and a Red and Delicious apple, but it's the closest we can come to comparing youth football to high school football to college football, because we're collecting data provided by athletic trainers. We're using the same technology, the same operational definitions. So it's kind of cool that we're able to make those comparisons across different levels of sport. It's really the first time anybody's been able to do that with as much of an apple and apples comparison as you can get. Now there are obviously differences. Generally a youth program only has one athletic trainer for several teams. High school, generally one athletic trainer for a team, whereas a college team might have several athletic trainers. So there are some differences, but overall we were pretty excited that it was pretty minimal. So then again, we began publishing those definitions in 17 and 21. So the current definition of injury used by the NCAA, and this was out of the most recent 2021 publication, but it's basically the same that we started back in 2009. But again, you can kind of read it there. I'm not going to read it verbatim. I know I've been talking a little long on previous slides. So what I want to do is provide a case example of how an athletic trainer can use injury surveillance data to make clinical decisions. So let's assume that we're a athletic trainer working with a men's lacrosse team at the NCAA level. We have 6 concussions during one season, and we're wondering, is that normal, or is that more than a typical men's lacrosse team would experience in one season? So this was a common question I got at the Datalys Center. We'd get some questions. Is it common for 4 quarterbacks to tear their ACL in one season? Be like, no, that's obviously a statistical outlier. But it's important because these are the kind of questions that athletic trainers have. And notoriously, and I'm just as guilty as all the other epidemiologists before me, is that we haven't been good at reporting these data in a way that makes sense to athletic trainers. And I think the next few slides will kind of highlight that. All right, so these are questions that an athletic trainer might ask. What is our rate of concussion? Is it similar to other college teams? What is the average number of concussions a college lacrosse team experiences on average? What is the risk of concussion? And I'll explain what all these terminologies mean as we go through the slides. And then when do concussions happen, practice or competition? The reason why that's important is because as athletic trainers, we can better make changes at the practice situation than we can in competitions. It's important for the NCAA to know what the risk and rate of injury is in competitions, because they can make policy and rule changes. But for us at the clinical setting, working with our coaches, we can change practices to make them more safe if for whatever reason they're not. So regarding question 1, what is the rate? So what is a rate? That is the number of concussions per some unit of time, and we usually define unit of time as athlete exposures. Now in Europe, they usually use hours of exposures, and I'm not going to go into the debate of one versus the other. We've used athlete exposures in the United States since the NAERS project back in 1974 first defined it. So when I got to the Datalys Center in 2009, when I started working on the new program, the NCAA didn't want to change anything. They wanted the historical continuity from 1986 up to current. So we didn't make any real changes in the definitions other than including the non-time loss injuries. So we kept using the athlete exposure definition. But you can see this would be the calculation here. So the sum of concussions, which is even if an athlete suffers more than one concussion, they get counted both times in this definition. So with a rate, all concussions are counted, even multiple concussions to the same athlete. And then you just divide that by the number of athlete exposures, multiply usually by 1,000 or 10,000 so that we get a number greater than 1. So it makes a little bit more intuitive sense. So what data do we have currently? So again, this is out of the most recent set of data from the Datalys Center, published in 2002 in the American Journal of Sports Medicine. The overall men's lacrosse rate is 3.9 per 10,000 athlete exposures, 10.3 for competitions, and 2.6 for practices. And these are just some other data that we can look up. Like for example, what's the average squad size of a lacrosse team, how many players there are in the NCAA, how many teams there are, for example. And we can use all these data then clinically to figure out some things on our own. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail as we go along. This is the website where you can find participation numbers for the NCAA sports. It'll tell you how many teams there are, how many total participants, how many schools sponsor the sport, the average team size, all that good information. This is the website where you'd find it for the high school. This is the National Federation of High School Associations. They also provide participation data. So again, going back to our case example of our lacrosse team, how do we interpret the overall rate of 3.9 concussions per 10,000 athlete exposures? I believe this is where we've failed our fellow clinicians by not better explaining what this means or using a better estimate of what risk is. But what this means is for every 10,000 players on the field, practices and games, there will be 3.9 concussions. So again, imagine how many lacrosse teams that would require, just about almost 300, 250 or so teams all practicing at the same time to create 3.9 concussions. And again, just playing with some math here, again, using these numbers that we figured out earlier, generally a lacrosse team will generate about almost 3,000 athlete exposures in a season. So if you take that number and you divide 10,000 by the 2926, that would mean that you'd have to have for a single lacrosse team, they'd have to have 3.4 seasons to generate or accumulate 10,000 exposures. So again, from a clinical perspective, what does that even mean, right? Like it doesn't make intuitive sense. Oh, the slides weren't advancing again. I apologize. Okay, technology. Okay, so again, these are some of the basic numbers we have. These are the participation websites. Again, I apologize. These are, again, the figures. So again, the case example, 3.9 concussions per 10,000. What does that mean for us? It's not very intuitive. So it's kind of like pulling your hair out, right? So 3.4 years, well, how many concussions occur in a season then, right? Because that seems to be more intuitive to us. So if we compare our team to the NCAA, then we can figure out our overall concussion rate. If we had 6 concussions, 5 in practice and 1 in a game, that would basically create a overall concussion rate of 20.5 or 20.5 per 10,000 athlete exposures. If you divide 20 by 3.9, 3.9 being the NCAA rate, our rate is 5.3 times higher than the NCAA rate. So in that sense, you could say, oh, why? Okay, so why is our rate so much higher than the average NCAA rate? And moving on to the next slide, hopefully it advanced. So again, now if we look at it from a practice versus game situation, again, we can't really change the game situation, but we can mitigate concussion risk during practice. So again, the NCAA concussion rate is 10.5, the practice rate is 2.6. For our case example, 5 of our concussions occurred in practice, 1 in game. So if you do the math there, we figure out that our practice rate is 8.4 times higher than the NCAA practice rate. So again, what the heck is going on in practice? Is it team culture? Is it that the coach runs more full contact drills? What's happening in practice that is causing this higher rate? And again, practices are easier to mitigate than competitions are from our perspective. So my thoughts on rates are that, they provide the most accurate estimate of incidents because they'll have the largest frequencies of both injuries and exposure. So that gives us very stable estimates from year to year. We have high school and college data published for most sports. We have a few youth sports like lacrosse and football that we've published on, and others have published on. The weaknesses are, again, it's not intuitive. What is 3.9 per 10,000 athlete exposures? What does that mean to the clinician? It's not very intuitive for us to use those numbers. So again, but that's what we've been publishing since 1974. So there's a lot of rates published. Unfortunately, just not very intuitive in looking at those. All right, so I think a more useful number for an athletic trainer is, or even a team physician, is what is the average number of concussions a men's lacrosse team might experience, and what is our frequency compared to that average? So we figure out the average of concussions per team season, as we say, by summing up the number of concussions. Again, athlete who suffers more than one concussion might be counted more than once in this. And then we divide that by team seasons, however many teams or seasons we're including in that. These are a couple of resources you can dig into to get those numbers. And the first one that we published in 2017, we simply provide the average for these sports. So men's sports, women's sports. It's not advancing again, sorry. So again, these would be the two publications I just mentioned. This would be the table out of the 2017 paper that we published. And again, men's sports, women's sports, the highlighted is our lacrosse teams. So you can see typically an NCAA lacrosse team will have about 1 plus or minus 1.4 concussions per season, about a half in practices or competitions. Now I don't like to say a half of a person, right? So I'll just generally round that up to 1, and the standard deviations are large enough that an average team is going to have about one concussion in competitions and 1 concussion in practices per year. Now, people are often surprised by that, especially like football, with the overall being 5.63 concussions per year for football. And it's interesting because with our NCAA data, as we were collecting it, every once in a while we'd get a team that would report 0 concussions in practice for a season. And whenever we had an outlier like that, we'd always contact the athletic trainer and make sure it was accurate. But there are some teams in the NCAA at the Division I level who will have 0 concussions in practice, and there's other teams that will have as many as 25, which is kind of shocking. So obviously, there's something the coaches are doing that either 1, are more protective, or 2, more risky for their players during practice. So this is how you could use that data, right? So as a clinician, I can look at this table and I can say, wow, okay, so my lacrosse team had 6 concussions this year, and the average is only about 1 to 2 in the NCAA. So why are we having so many more? And really, I believe that athletic trainers should be doing this on a season-by-season basis. You should be comparing your injury frequencies and/or rates and risks that of the NCAA. And unfortunately, the reason why I don't think it's been easy for clinicians to do that in the past is because we've only really ever published rates. And again, rates are very hard to interpret. This was one of the last papers we published before I left the Datalys Center. And my goal of this paper was to demonstrate how we can calculate out these average numbers per team. And also from the same paper, we published the risks. And again, those numbers are much more important for a clinician to be able to see than not. I was kind of hopeful that the new team at Datalys would continue on our work with these numbers and also provide the averages and the risks, but they in their most recent data set, they did not. So moving on to the next slide here, again, this one is from the most recent paper out of the Datalys Center. Now, the way they published their frequencies is by these national estimates. They didn't report the actual average number per team season like we just showed in the previous slide. So unfortunately, in order to figure these out, we have to do some math. So if you take the national estimate, and this is a 5-year national estimate, so this is how many would occur over 5 years in the NCAA. So the first thing you have to do is you have to divide that by 5, and then we figure out the number per year from that, and then we divide that by the number of teams, which is 386. So we get 1.3 concussions per team season from this paper, and that's pretty close to what we had in the previous slide, which was about 1 to 2 or so, based on the standard deviations. So still pretty consistent. You're going to see variation like that, the way they report it versus the way we reported it, but overall fairly similar, about two or so a year. Moving on to the next slide. So again, to kind of summarize what we found, we had 5 concussions in practice, 1 in competition. The average is in the NCAA is 1.3 overall, or 0.52 in practices. So again, our case number of concussions was 6 divided by 1.3 means our average number of concussions was 4.6 times higher, or in practice 9.6 times higher. So again, what are we doing in practice that's causing our athletes to get more concussions? The one thing I would always caution when you just working with year by year frequencies like this, though, is you can have an outlier year. Like I said, I had an NCAA football team call us and ask us if it was common for 4 quarterbacks to tear their ACL in one season, and that was obviously an outlier. So you could always have one year where things are crazy. So I generally consider more than one season before going to the coach and saying, hey, your practices are too dangerous, we're having too many concussions in practice. I would have either 2 or 3 years data to back that up. Now, you might want to bring it up, at the end of the year, kind of follow up to say, hey, we had a lot of concussions this year. Did anything change in practice? The culture amongst the players changed. Did we get a new, coaching staff? Was there some kind of policy that changed that might lead to that? So again, I think this is a very useful number for athletic trainers to make those real-time, season-by-season decisions. But again, be a little careful. You could just have an outlying season where the numbers are really crazy. So again, it's just much more easy to interpret the average per team season than it is the rate. So again, easy to interpret. Weaknesses are subject to year-to-year variation. Just be careful before you start throwing accusations around if you have a bad practice year. And there's few studies that have published the average per team season. We did it for concussions. I'm working on a manuscript right now to do it for overall injuries as well as time loss and non-time loss, and then hopefully I'll do another paper where I pick out some specific injuries like ACL and other things as well. But I'm trying to get that published as soon as possible to get that out. All right, so the last thing I would think about is, what is the risk? Now, risk is also easy to interpret. It's basically the sum of athletes with at least 1 concussion divided by the athletes on the team. Now, again, depending on how deep in the weeds you want to get with the mathematics, using the number of athletes on the team isn't always considered the best because you have attrition over the course of the season. So sometimes you could, if you wanted to, you could use the number of athletes at mid-season because you'll have lost some over the season, or you can use the number of athletes at the end of the season, or account for the attrition as it goes along, kind of a survival analysis technique. But it's easy enough just for the clinician to figure out the risk by using the number of athletes that started the interval or the team season. Now with this one, we only count athletes once. So that's the big difference between the previous 2 calculations, is that this one, if an athlete suffers more than 1 concussion, they're still only counted once. It's just the risk of suffering at least 1 concussion. And again, we're going to use the same 2 resources as before. My slide didn't advance again. I'm sorry. I'm just struggling with this. But again, so the risk is just the sum of the athletes with at least 1 concussion divided by the number of athletes on the team. Again, same 2 resources that we had before. And again, in that same resource from 17, we published what the risk of concussion is in lacrosse as well as other sports. And what that means, and the nice thing about risks is that there's simply a percentage, right? And everybody, coaches, parents, everybody understands percentages. So what this means is that for the risk pooled, as you see there, is that 2.5% of lacrosse athletes are at risk of suffering a concussion in a season. And the weighted just accounts for some of the variation, but that's always going to be a little bit higher. So that's about 2.8. So on average, about 3, the risk of concussion in lacrosse, college lacrosse, is about 3%. So if you have 100 athletes, again, 3 of them are going to suffer a concussion. Average is about 38 per team, so that's where we end up with about 1.3 to 2 concussions per season. So again, I think this is much more useful and easier to interpret than the rates are, for example. This is from the most recent publication coming out of the Datalys Center with the NCAA data. Again, you have to figure out, because they only provided the 5-year national estimates again, so you have to do the math to whittle that down. And what they found is 3.5% is the risk for men's lacrosse in the most recent data set. So that's a little bit higher than the 2017 estimate. Now, is that a true difference? We don't know. Again, because we're doing the mathematics a little bit differently here off of this table than the previous, it could be just some of the variation in the way that we're coming up with the numbers, because we don't have the raw data that we need. Okay, so again, if we use our case example, so we had 5 athletes suffer 1 concussion. Remember, 1 player suffered 2. So that means we're only going to use 5 because we only count our athletes once. We have 38 players on the team. So we divide 5 by 38, multiply that by 100, and we end up with 13.2%. So again, comparing that to the NCAA, which is 3.5 out of the most recent sample, our risk of suffering a concussion is 3.8 times higher than the national average amongst the NCAA. So again, something's going on with our team that we can potentially mitigate, especially since we figured out that it's also occurring in practices. That's all right. So again, some of the strengths of using the risk is that it's just a percentage, so it's very easily calculated and understood. It's actionable. Same thing along with the averages, we can make changes based on these numbers to say what's going on at our situation that's different than everybody else. Again, some of the weaknesses that people will cite is that it doesn't account for multiple concussions to the same person, and we haven't just published enough of these data that makes it easy for athletic trainers to calculate this stuff or figure out or make comparisons. All right, so this next slide just kind of summarizes everything we found. And basically, the team is our team, our lacrosse team, and the NCAA is the average across the NCAAs. So you see their rates here. You can figure out what the ratio is between them. Same thing for the average number of concussions. Again, the ratios being higher. Now, the nice thing about these type of data is you can stratify it by different things. So you can look at all injuries, you can look at time loss and non-time loss injuries, you can compare game to practice injuries, you can compare ACLs, concussions, hamstrings, however you want to stratify that data. You can use these same calculations to figure out the risks, the average and the rate for each of those different types of injuries. Now, I just wanted to throw this in here. It's a bit confusing, but I basically just switched around the team versus the NCAA. So now we're dividing our team by the NCAA. So these are the rates. And what happens when you do that is you get a ratio less than 1. And the way we interpret that in epidemiology is that we say the team rate is 81% lower than the NCAA rate. Trying to think, yeah. So, but yeah. So anything we consider less than 1 is generally protective. Okay, some percentage difference lower. Oop, didn't switch the slide again. Sorry. So again, we basically switched the NCAA and the team here, divided the team by the NCAA ratio, and what ends up happening there is the way we interpret this is that the team rate is 81%, or the difference is 81% lower. So trying to think better example of that. But anyway, whenever you have a ratio that's less than 1, we consider that protective or some lower difference, or difference lower. Now this is from a paper we published in JAMA Pediatrics, but the reason why I wanted to throw this in here is because we figured out what the written, so again, this is where we were able to compare youth football players to high school football players and college football players using the same technology operational definitions provided by athletic trainers, etc. And what we did is we calculated out the injury rate ratio between games and practices. So this indicates that in youth football, the injury rate in games is 4 times higher, 3 times higher in high school, but 7 times higher in college. Now, what that means is that college coaches are actually doing a better job making practices safer. Because again, the larger the rate ratio means that the rate is much higher in games than it is practices. Because again, we can change the safety of practices much easier than games, at least at the clinical level. So what this is telling us is that youth and high school coaches could do a better job of making their practices safer. Follow the example of the NCAA and just don't bang heads as much. So that's again another example of how we can use these data to make things a little bit safer. Did it again. Driving me nuts. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm struggling with this. But anyway, so again, just I was discussing this slide here. Again, you can see the difference between the game and practice rates for youth, high school, and college, with college being much higher during competitions, which means it's much lower during practices, is what you want to see. So we'd like to see these rates for youth and high school to be as high as the NCAA rate, indicating that practices are safer at the NCAA rate than at the youth rate, or at the youth setting or high school setting. So again, we're going to make some comparisons. Why is football kind of the poster child for concussion? So again, this was from that paper we published recently. Just skipping ahead, so to the first bit of slides here. So this is the average number per team. You've seen this in table form, but I just wanted to throw it into bar graph form because it looks much more impressive when you see it on the bar graph like this versus just in table form. But so this is the average number of concussions a football team will suffer in a season. Looks bad, right? It's much higher. Looks much higher than the next teams in the list. But if we then can look at squad size, you'll notice that the squad size looks fairly similar, but men's lacrosse has one of the larger teams along with football, the average in the NCAA being 107, 38 for lacrosse, etc. So that's kind of interesting. But then if we use the athlete exposures as our denominator, so we calculate out that rate, we find that wrestling actually has a higher rate than women's ice hockey, which comes in second, followed by football. And these differences that you see between football and women's ice hockey and men's ice hockey aren't statistically different. The difference between wrestling and the rest are. And then this drop off down to soccer and women's soccer and basketball is also statistically different between the men's ice hockey and football. But it goes to show you that simply looking at the average number of injuries for a team can be a little misleading as well. So I always want to caution against that because I've been kind of preaching that using the average number of injuries per team per season is a nice way to look at things. But again, you got to kind of put that in context. So it's kind of interesting. And then if we look at the risk, so now again we're controlling for squad size, right? So we're dividing the number of concussions by the number of athletes on the team. We still see that wrestling's the highest, women's ice hockey is still high, and then men's ice hockey is right behind women's, and then you have this large drop off where football and women's basketball are basically tied. So it's interesting, right? So there's actually a higher rate and a higher risk of injury in wrestling, men's and women's ice hockey than football, but football remains the poster child of concussion. And why is that? Well, when's the last time you've seen an entire Saturday and Monday night and Thursday night devoted to women's ice hockey or college wrestling, right? So the other thing is, you know, people go to 100,000 plus person stadiums to go watch college football. College football generates about 5 concussions per season, so the likelihood that people are going to see a concussion on TV of somebody playing football or seeing it in person if you go to the game is much higher than you seeing a concussion occurring in ice hockey. And again, because ice hockey doesn't generate as many, simply because they have smaller squad sizes, you know, that kind of accounts for the difference there. So you know, when we published that data, the wrestling and women's ice hockey communities were not happy with us for publishing that data. They were quite happy that football was getting all the heat about concussions and they weren't getting as much. So let's see, next slide here. So again, to summarize the case study that we just went through, we can calculate out the rate of injury, which is the sum of injuries, so all concussions divided by the athlete exposures. We can calculate the average number of team injuries per season. So for our team, it's just whatever we had that season, but to calculate it out for the NCAA requires a little bit of work to some degree, except for concussion because we've published that data. But for some of the other injuries like ACL and stuff, we have to do some of the work based on what's published. Same thing with risks. A lot of studies haven't published the risks except the one we published for concussion. So we have to do a little bit of math to calculate those as well. But I think the nice thing about the average number and the risk is that it's very interpretable, easy to explain to coaches and parents. It allows us to put things into kind of real-time context where the rate of injury, although more accurate measure of incidence, is just not as easy to interpret and explain to people. So the next couple slides here, I have a couple resources. This is the women's sports. What I did is I took the several studies that you see listed down there. Again, this is from a publication I got in the works right now, but I wanted to share this with you because I think it's useful. So what I did is I found the rates for the different sports that have been published. For the average number per team season, for the paper that we did publish, I provided that in terms of the averages per season, and then also the percent risk. So this allows an athletic trainer to take this table and look at it and say, all right, what was our rate of concussion on our women's soccer team this year? What was our rate in practice? What was our rate in competition? What is the average number of concussions that occur on a soccer team in a season? Where do we fall on that scale? And then you can do the same thing with the risk. So again, you might be higher, you might be lower. And again, I think the important part is if you're suffering more injuries during practice, that can be mitigated. If it's happening in competition, it might just be bad luck or whatever other reason might be going on there. Again, we have little control over what happens in competitions, but practice we can certainly make recommendations to the coaches saying, hey coach, maybe you want to stop banging heads one day a week. We had a lot of concussions this year compared to everybody else, or that sort of thing, or maybe our concussions have been consistently higher for the past 2 seasons than the rest of the NCAA or the rest of the high schools, that kind of thing. This table is just for the men's. And again, if you want these tables either in PDF format, because I know they're kind of small to see on the slides here, or if you want the Excel version, I'll be happy to provide that also. Just shoot me an email. If you're interested in any of my publications, you can look me up on Google Scholar, just Thomas Dompier, and you'll be able to find all of our publications, or at least through my time at Datalys on there. And then the 2021 volume 7 version of the Journal of Athletic Training has the most recent most recent publications from the Datalys Center with the NCAA data in it. Now, we have published a bunch of papers in the high school as well. Those mostly came out from 2018 to 2020. So there's also some papers out there with the high school data also. So again, I want to just thank Relieve Sports Medicine and Jessica and Ann for the invitation to speak today. Thanking again the thousands of athletic trainers. Maybe some of you have participated in one of these programs, so thank you. And if you are working in a high school or a college setting, perhaps considering reaching out to Datalys and seeing if you want to participate or not. Any questions? These are just the references you can refer to as well.
All right, hello, awesome. Thank you so much. I am just going to go through. Jessica has joined us tonight as well. She wanted to say thank you so much for your time and your research presentation today, and for the Releve Sports Medicine Journal Club, and go Spartans.
Yeah, there you go. Go green, go white. Not having a very good season this season though.
You know, maybe next year, maybe next year. All right, and there was one question here, and that was, and it may have been on one of the earlier slides, the high school EMRs that you were talking about that are free, that communicate with the I think it was that the NEIS system.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me.
Yeah. So there's ATS next. Oh, I can share my screen.
I was going to pop that up in case you wanted to show this screen. Okay.
Yeah, let me scroll back to that. Here's some here. Hopefully you can see that. My screen sharing.
Yes. Yep, we can see that with sportswear, Plan Tech, ATS. Perfect.
Yeah, and the injury surveillance tool down at the bottom there, that's actually free to use. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles that the commercial systems do, but we get a lot of compliments from the athletic trainers that do use those systems. And sometimes if you're in a high school, you don't have a big budget, it's kind of nice to have a free EMR to use. Other questions? Can't see if there's a chat window or not. I didn't see if there's
any. They post them in the Q&A there. So yeah, I've been mostly just answering a little bit of the things as we've gone along, but
I apologize again for the slides not cooperating quite so well.
No, it looks like you've got two screens. You're bouncing back and forth.
And again, feel free to share the slides with anybody that would like them. I think I provided them to you if I remember. If not, I can send them on.
Yeah, I will let Ann know then. Ann and Jessica tomorrow. Well, Jessica knows. Yeah. All right, perfect. And then, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. If they do have questions, certainly you've given your contact information, so I'm sure that they'll reach out if there are some additional questions. I appreciate you taking your time tonight, and like I said, thank you for sharing such great information, and certainly you've definitely impacted not just athletic trainers, but just the whole sports medicine community here across the entire team, because I know I've personally referenced that information at multiple different levels, and that type of aggregate information to share with, whether it's players, whether it's coaches, whether it's parents. Sometimes they want to, they're coming and asking, okay, what's the least risky sport that I can put my kid into, and you can say, well, realistically, we can march through. Let's jump from the bottom, and look at those injury rates and march our way on up. So it can't be done without folks who are getting into the thick of the epidemiology to be able to get us that information. Lisa Litzelman, who was asking a few different questions throughout the presentation, she just wanted to say thank you very much. This was very informative.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Right.
And yeah, feel free to reach out with any questions, and my email's on there. Happy to chat anytime.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and I hope that everyone has a great night.
All right, thank you.